everyone, I'm Singh, and I'm here to talk about React Native everywhere. When I mean everywhere, including down here with these lovely little penguins. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the founder of Guild. It's a new platform currently in beta aimed at elevating communities around the world. Come chat with me if you're curious about the platform. And as I'm sure you might have noticed by now, my accent is certainly not from around here. That's because I'm actually from Toronto, Canada, where back in 2010, I started the Toronto JavaScript community. You see, back in those early days, I was subject to a lot of banter about JavaScript. Oh, you aren't a real developer unless you program in C++ or .NET or Java, they used to say. And I was taken aback because if you've ever built a JavaScript application before, you know how complicated and how diligent you have to be about it. Back around 2010, we were just starting to build applications using Backbone and Underscore, and you remember how complex those beasts were. So I started Toronto.js to get folks together, get them talking, and learn from each other. I thought together as a community, we're able to ask each other questions and kind of elevate our craft as a whole. So a lot of what I did back then with Toronto.js serves as my impetus for building Guild today. What I quickly discovered was that communities are everywhere. We're at a similar community here right now. In fact, a lot of my closest friends are people that I met through the community, some of whom are watching this talk at this very moment. So I packed my bags and moved to London in 2017 to explore those communities across the world. And that's also when I was introduced to React Native on every platform. Here you can see me giving a talk about that back in 2017. This tweet is from Ellie, an organizer of that event, and also a very good friend now as well. You can find that presentation posted on Guild. If you go to beta.guild.host/Taz, you can see my presentations. And if you click on that, you can actually watch the presentation itself. So feel free to go take a look. But to give you a very, very quick rundown of that talk, because it serves as the basis for this talk, basically I talk about what it takes to build using React Native to share common code for every platform. So if this is your common code for every platform, you can wrap that with unique code for individual platforms where just about 95% plus of your code is shared across every platform. You can push those unique aspects to the edges, and this is what makes React Native so unique and so great at accommodating every platform by enabling you to focus on common code within the middle. So all of that, like these days, is actually packaged up nicely in Expo. So the talk I gave in 2017 was doing this manually. Expo does a lot of this for you automatically these days. And even their homepage says, make any app, run it everywhere. So feel free to go take a look at the docs on their site for a much more up-to-date version on how to kind of do this today. So that's my journey to date. And so today I'm talking about part 2 of that, which is essentially responsiveness and navigation in a React Native everywhere application. So let's start with responsiveness. It's no secret that different form factors exist. And so when building an app that works everywhere, we obviously need to take this into account. You'd expect a platform like React Native to do this well, but it really just provides the basic primitives. Critically, there's no CSS. That means that there's no media queries. That means that there's no CSS grid. That means that there's no CSS selectors at all. There's no first child, last child, nth child support. There's none of that. So styling in React Native is inspired by CSS in that they use CSS property names and they have a flexbox implementation, but CSS itself doesn't exist in React Native. And so if you've ever built a responsive web application before, you can likely start to see how challenging it is to build those same UIs without any of those web-based CSS constructs essentially that we're used to. So what do I do? Well, fortunately for me, I went to Bangalore to consult in 2017. And the organizers, well, first of all, I burned it down. But I went to Bangalore to consult in 2017. And the organizers, Kiran, got a hold of me back then and asked me if I wanted to present for the community over there. So I agreed, because communities are everywhere, after all. And so here I am talking about a Pontiac Aztec at React Bangalore in 2017, a truly magnificent car. I had the pleasure of getting to know the community there, and in fact, sitting next to me here is basically Siddharth, who's now one of the foremost experts in design system space, and then of course next to him is Kiran, a good friend. So basically, around the time that I was looking at the solution to solve my responsiveness problems in React Native, it was around 2020, and Siddharth came out with React UI. Where the website itself says React UI comes with a set of components that are accessible, responsive, and customizable. That sounds like exactly what I want. It also has a list of components that it ships with. Reading from the right, there's element, link, select, text, text area, and so on. And critically at the bottom, there's stack and grid to help you build a layout, like essentially composing those other building blocks essentially into them. So this sounds like exactly what I want, but it's built for web. So maybe I could take this and maybe I could create a React Native design system using this. Maybe those layout constructs would help me with my responsiveness in my React Native application. So I tried doing exactly that. And after a bunch of trial and error, I finally got something working. So I thought to message Sid. I said, hey Sid, how's it going? You enjoying Amsterdam? I wanted to reach out to say that I'm a big fan of React UI. In fact, I'm such a big fan that I ended up implementing large parts of it for my React Native application in a cross-platform manner. It's a shameless rip off of React UI, but of course React UI is for the web, and what I've done is for React Native. Thus, no emotion, no CSS, I've had to implement stack a bit differently, and so on. Sid very kindly responded, that's really cool. React UI is a rip-off of Theme UI, rip-offs all the way down. And as the great saying goes, good artists copy, great artists steal, or something like that. So looking at the dates on these messages, you can see this was peak lockdown in 2020 that I was working on this. And so here's an example of what I worked on. This is straight production code, straight out of our Guild platform. And so the code is on the left and the rendered UI is on the right. And hopefully just by looking at the code, you can kind of determine what's going on. You can critically see that those stacks have gaps, and those stacks really compose the rest of the design system, like primitives upwards. So we have a link, we have text, and at the bottom there, we have that user item, which is displayed conditionally if we have a presenter. So taking a look at that, so I've highlighted the exact part of that UI on the right with the dotted red line. We can see on the left, it's also just another stack. And that is a horizontal stack that has a primary photo and has a link. And so fundamentally, by composing these stacks upwards, we can start to build a UI that is composable, like essentially in React Native. Okay, but what about that responsiveness that I talked about earlier? Well, here again, straight production code out of Guild. So apologies for if it's a bit a bit messy and a bit obscure. But I wanted to show you the reality of how we build these UIs. On here, you can see a grid and you can see columns as well. So a composition of stacks and grids and columns with the presentation card that I showed you earlier ends up building this whole UI that I'm showing you on the right. And again, you can just go to Guild and see this directly for yourself. But fundamentally, by composing stacks and grids and columns, we can start building fully responsive UIs in React Native very easily. So at this point, I was pretty happy with myself. I said, oh, I got a lovely design system here. All of Guild is built in this way. I thought I'd come up with a snazzy name for it. So I came up with the name Mondrian. This was inspired by the famous Dutch design system engineer, Piet Mondrian, who's known for composing stacks into UIs that kind of look a bit like this. So I created an empty repo on GitHub and started preparing for a public release of Mondrian. And that's when I found out about native base. So if you're familiar with native base, it's every platform design system, comparing it to Mondrian's and every platform design system. It's a bit more comprehensive than what we have. We're only at 000 alpha 3. They're at version 3.4.6 at the moment. They've spent far more time on accessibility than we have. I don't even know what the accessibility for our stuff looks like. I hope it looks good, but who really knows? They have documentation when good luck trying to figure out what we have. And critically, theirs is built in Bangalore, which is the inspiration for our design system at the end of the day, meeting the community there and learning from them. So fundamentally, I would recommend if you wanted a React Native, every platform design system, just go use native base. It's a lovely piece of work. And the folks that have built it have spent a lot of time thinking about it. So go check out native base. Okay, so up next, navigation, the second part of building an every platform application using React Native. So in terms of navigation, there's like two types of navigation as I see it. There's mobile and desktop navigation, where you basically use the UI to kind of navigate around. You tap on a button, you tap on on some sort of UI component, and that's what navigates you onwards. Then there's web-based navigation, where, yeah, you can interact with the UI, but there's also a back button, there's a forward button, there's a refresh button, there's a URL bar, there's tabs, there's a whole, browser that kind of surrounds the actual UI that you can interact with. So all these web-based controls don't really exist on mobile and desktop. Like, there's a few exceptions, but for the most part, that's the difference. And critically, there's one UI pattern that I want to focus on. So it's taken here from the Instagram website. This is the Instagram of my cat, Janeway. Isn't she adorable? And so here you can see by clicking on an image of her, it opens in a modal. And that modal opens up because it knows what to place in the background. That modal has a URL essentially in the URL bar, and I can open a new tab, paste that in, and then the image opens as a full page because it doesn't quite know what to put in the background because it's a brand new page. You can land there from anywhere. This type of navigational pattern doesn't really exist on mobile and desktop, but it of course does exist on web. So in building a truly 95+% application shared across every platform, we need to account for differences like this, and our navigational paradigm needs to be able to accommodate it. So how do we do that? Well, there's React Router. And so I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with React Router. They have a React Router native package on there. And critically, what they do really well is state management. Like the back and forward, the refresh, landing on a new page, all of that stuff works really, really well because it's really tailored, essentially for web. The part that I found it doesn't have is that native feel, when you can swipe from the side of a screen essentially on a native mobile app, and it will go back, the animations and all of that. It doesn't have any of that, so it's great for state management, not so good for the native feel. Then we have React Navigation that actually launched web support relatively recently. So they do support web, and they do have a native feeling, implementation as well. They have that kind of slide from the edge of the screen. All of that stuff works. However, in practice, when using this on the web, I found it was quite quirky and quite janky. I found that if you're code splitting your bundle and you're asynchronously loading in pages as you navigate, the URL also asynchronously, essentially resolves as those pages are loaded in, which is a bit odd. Essentially, if you're used to using the web, you're used to just the URL being the URL. You're not used to the URL kind of rewriting itself as asynchronous chunks load. That's a weird UX. I also found that going back and forth frequently would kind of put React Navigation into some sort of weird state that it just couldn't recover from. And the user would have to hard refresh and then get that asynchronous resolution of the URL again. So I found it to be just a bit odd. So basically, if we were to look at the two, React Router, again, has excellent state management. React Navigation, it kind of works, but it's kind of janky on web. On native, it's I find it's pretty good because you don't have that back and forth button. So I find on native it's actually pretty good. React Router doesn't feel native, while React Navigation feels actually very good on native. And so for these two solutions, React Router and React Navigation, if we were to choose one, because again, we want 95% plus code sharing on every platform, the one I'd probably pick is React Navigation. So that's the one that we went with. And despite its flaws, the UX won't be ideal. The users will just have to live with it because that's the best we have. And I'm sure the team working at React Navigation is working really hard on it, and I'm sure they'll resolve these issues in time, and we'll just upgrade essentially as they release these features, and then our users can benefit at that time. And so, yeah, that's the current state of every platform navigation. Thanks so much for your time. No, I'm just kidding. That would be a terrible way to end a talk. Are you kidding me? There's no real solution there. What? We can do better than that. Come on. I think I fooled some of you, though. So if you've learned anything by now, you'd know that I solve all of my problems with incessant complaining to folks in the community. So this time I was complaining about essentially every platform navigation to my good friend Lorenzo, pictured here in the only picture that I have with him, taken at my friend Phil and Cindy's wedding. So Lorenzo is a former maintainer of React Navigation and is heavily involved with React Native community efforts. Oftentimes when I don't know of a good way to proceed in the React Native space, I go and look for him for guidance, as he tends to know a lot of the community happenings before others do. And this time, he really came through. He told me about this library called React Native URL Router. that sounds like exactly what I want. I want a React Native router that uses URLs to route. And so I took a look at the documentation, and if you can see the code on the left, it's actually pulling in React Router to handle all the state management, but they have the React Native screens, which allows you to have that native feel of like sliding back and forth from the side of the screen, and everything feels native. So it has the best of both worlds. If you look at the definition there in the code, it's a native router with a stack navigator and a bunch of routes inside of it. If you're used to using React Router, it's basically a browser router with a routes component and then routes inside of that. It's very similar to things that we're used to essentially in the React world. So this looked amazing. I went to go try it, and unfortunately, it just didn't work on web. It's actually built for mobile. It just didn't work on web. So I thought, well, this looks really good. It looks like it can just work on web. It looks like it should be easily adapted. So I thought to get in touch with the maintainer, Alec, from Software Mansion, and just message him to see if he has any thoughts on how it could work on web so that we can actually start working on this thing together. He was very kind. He responded quickly, and we actually set up a call shortly thereafter. And what I received in that call really surprised me. So I was expecting just myself and Alec to sit down and just to talk about, how to make that like essentially the future of web compatibility for React Native URL router. But then Christoph joined, the director of engineering at Software Mansion. And at this point, I'm thinking like, oh my goodness, this is going to be one of those like sales consultancy calls where like the director of engineering says, well, Taz, we're a consultancy. And if you want some help in this space, you can always just hire our consultancy to help you. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I don't want to deal with this right now. I just want a library that works. But instead, my expectation was completely wrong. Instead, they were so kind and so willing to help that I don't think I've seen this type of support from anywhere else. Essentially what Software Mansion wanted was they wanted a production level application that will use React Native URL router so that they can test out all the paradigms and make sure it has good support. And what we wanted at Guild was we wanted a fantastic navigational experience such that we can effectively develop and ship to every platform. And so it was really just a really good match. We said like essentially in the call that, hey, doesn't it make sense to partner up? And doesn't it make sense to work on this thing together? We'll be the guinea pig for the new library, and together we can work on shipping something great. Really, Christoph joined the call because he was more curious about Guild as a platform and how it could actually help with Software Mansion's community efforts. And in fact, I'm actually sitting in the Software Mansion office right now because I'm attending App.js Conf at this very moment today and tomorrow, which is, again, one of their community efforts. So I can only speak of Software Mansion in the highest and thank them so much for accommodating me here. So after that talk, I basically went forward and started to rewrite the entire application using React Router as a stepping stone to start using React Native URL Router. You can see the stats of that PR here, where I've deleted more than double the code essentially than I added. The overall app feels so much snappier now. It feels lightweight. It feels like I removed a lot of code. And so I have to ask you, did you even notice? Essentially, if you went to the Guild website or if you've used Guild in the past, did you notice that it's using an experimental homegrown design system? Did you notice that it's using an experimental not yet ready router as well? Did you even notice any of this, or did you just think it's an ordinary web application built in ordinary ways and just works as a web application should? And that's really the beauty of React Native fundamentally, is being able to write common code that essentially for every platform and push the uniqueness out to the boundaries where you're still accommodating the unique aspects of every single platform as well. But fundamentally, that's not the point of my talk. That's not the main takeaway. I'm fortunate and privileged through this journey to have met the people that I've met through the community. Without them and without their support, I would be nowhere at all. And it's not like I'm special. I really just go to events and I talk to people and I learn from them and I introduce them to the people around me. That's exactly why I started Toronto.js back in 2010, and that's exactly why I'm working on Guild now, because we're only as good as a community around us. At the end of the day, communities are everywhere, and now your technology is too. Thank you very much.